let's take a look tonight. There are actually several solid examples where sitting or former heads of state are prosecuted for actions or crimes committed when they were in office.
Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been sentenced to 1 year in prison.
Lula has been convicted of graft and money laundering and sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. If the conviction is upheld, he will not be able to run in elections.
Now, there are lessons in some of these cases. The strongest legal precedents from abroad in this situation tend to involve abuse of office, a politician who abused power or corruptly enriched themselves, which makes sense, as opposed to a prosecutor running down a former president or something else. In France, we showed you President Sarkozy charged and convicted of corruption and got a 1-year sentence served in home confinement. In Italy, a media mogul turned flamboyant politician who's drawn Trump comparisons, Berlusconi, faced trials that showed in that country no politician was above the law.
The tax fraud trial of former Italian Prime Minister and media magnate Silvio Berlusconi. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison.
Silvio Berlusconi says he does not want to run for Prime Minister, but he is obligated to because the country needs him.
Separately, Berlusconi is also on trial accused of paying for sex with an, at the time, underage Moroccan exotic dancer. Friday's verdict barred him from holding public office for the next 3 years.
He was convicted actually 4 times on charges from tax evasion to embezzlement and then barred from holding office in that country. We showed you Brazil, where Lula was convicted on corruption charges that drew a hefty 13-year prison sentence. At one time, each of those European leaders were, of course, on top in their countries with loyal followings. Their trials, though, were ultimately seen as positive for the rule of law, not some kind of strain on the nation or the public's ability to comprehend that a former leader is also a citizen and subject to the law. Now, take Israel, a small country with a relatively tight-knit political class. It has seen prime ministers across a range of ideologies face trials for corruption.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert began his prison sentence Monday morning. It'll be at least 18 months behind bars. Olmert's conviction goes back to what's called the Holy Land affair, a corrupt real estate deal.
Tonight, Benjamin Netanyahu is in trouble. Israel's Attorney General, one of Netanyahu's former close advisors, indicted the prime minister on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust.
It's abuse of power that tends to tie some of these cases together around the world. There are other precedents that, of course, can also blur the lines of crime or simply poor performance in office. Iceland convicted its former prime minister for basically how he handled the financial crisis, and that did spark debates over whether it was just criminalizing poor performance in office. But there are many, many examples. We're looking at a fraction of world leaders prosecuted in what I showed you tonight, and few experts argue that too many prosecutions in a single country is something you want to follow. I mean, you see countries that have corruption problems or politicized prosecutions with weak controls, and they can certainly spiral into a kind of norm where there are too many prosecutions. Take Peru. One account shows that, quote, all but one of Peru's past 7 presidents have faced criminal charges. 4 living ex-presidents of South Korea have been convicted. That's not necessarily a great sign for those countries. But if there is a broader theme, it's that many democracies have tried or convicted former leaders based on the evidence and found the process can work, the nation can handle it, and the punishment can deter abuse of power and corruption. Now, the U.S. never got closer than that brick wall of Nixon's pardon. That was at the federal level. Unlike most democracies, of course, America has this sort of 2-tier government system. The states really have their own governments, as we know. They have their own leaders and their own powers, and governors oversee their own prosecutors and police forces. So it's worth noting that more than 15 heads of these states, if you will, I'm talking about American states, have also been indicted. Governors, commonly indicted in America. Illinois, for example, saw 2 governors tried and convicted and got lengthy prison terms. One was Republican, George Ryan. The other was a Democrat who's pretty famous by now, Rod Blagojevich. He was busted for trying to get bribes to fill Obama's Senate seat.
The FBI tapped his phones and got 500 hours of secret recordings.
Prosecutors say Blagojevich is plotting to take campaign donations from candidates he knows he'll never appoint.
Blair Hull actually thinks he can be senator. You believe this guy? He's an idiot. Huh?
That's cool. So does Jesse Jr.
Yeah. He's got people calling my house now, Jesse Jr.
Well, he's putting the full court press on. He's going to raise you money, pal.
Blagojevich ultimately served 8 years. He got a pardon from his former apprentice castmate, Donald Trump. Now, Trump and Nixon faced evidence of abusing power to basically subvert democracy or try to steal elections. Now, that's one of the most serious crimes you can commit in office. It's on par with that Illinois president that I just showed you, the precedent there where Blagojevich was abusing the government power he had over a Senate seat, which got him indicted. You also have the foreign cases that, again, often turn on corruption. So you're abusing the power you have, the public faith of the democracy you're running, and later it's catching up with you. Now, there's even more bad news for Trump here because other more minor legal offenses also can carry the prospect of indicting a former president. Consider that it was federal prosecutors in the Clinton case who did not allege that then President Clinton was doing corruption in Whitewater, the original reason for that probe, or that he attempted a coup, or that he did anything regarding an insurrection. No. What they alleged about Clinton was that he lied. And he lied in a government proceeding, which can be perjury, right? And they pressed the real possibility of a criminal indictment of former President Clinton after he left office. That was on the table, which led to them negotiating this deal to avoid that very prosecution.
President Clinton has just a few hours left at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but he's making news right down to the wire. On Friday, he accepted a deal to end the independent counsel's investigation of his role in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, thereby avoiding indictment after leaving office.
He has acknowledged that some of his answers were false. He has agreed to a 5-year suspension of his Arkansas bar license.
That last voice was Ken Starr's replacement in that office, former prosecutor Robert Ray. He announced the suspension there of Clinton's law license. Now, Ray went on to defend Donald Trump at his impeachment. You might even recognize him from some appearances on this very program. But the key in that Clinton example with then counsel Ray is that the indictment of that former president was legally on the table. Clinton's team decided to cut that deal to avoid that prospect after he left office. And the Watergate jurors also viewed a Nixon indictment as on the table after he left office. History shows one juror recounting how 19 people in that secret grand jury room raised their hands about wanting an indictment of Nixon. Prosecutors then developed those written charges, which became a kind of so-called roadmap, the list of evidence and facts, not opinions, that many see echoed now in the January 6th committee's evidence, which was highlighted in the displays at those public hearings. Now, this history does not answer the legal question over whether Donald Trump should be indicted by the DOJ or the Georgia prosecutor, or potentially in both cases. Only the evidence can speak to that legal question. We are not prejudging or foreclosing it here. But this is important, and there's a reason why we're walking through this right now at this moment. The history shows that subjecting former heads of state to the full prospect of a justice system in a democracy, which can include possible trial and conviction, is not a departure from democracy. It is not something that is dangerous or precedent busting. It is, if you actually look at history, a feature of the rule of law. You can see that in these cases of American presidents in both parties and governors in American states from both parties and these democracies abroad, which the U.S. has sometimes touted as allies or examples. And so if you hear lately, or particularly in the coming months, that a Trump indictment would be unprecedented or risky or set some kind of new, dangerous cycle of prosecution in America, well, you've learned it tonight. You are hearing something false if someone tries to convince you of that. Now, why would someone want you to think that false thing? A thing that also might make an indictment less likely, if we believe that these prosecutors exist in the real world of humans, or what people say and do affects other humans. Well, if somebody's trying to convince you that this is so much more rare than it is, maybe they're a Donald Trump apologist, trying to lie or scare the public away from a sober, more evidence-based approach to this issue. Or, and this is interesting, if someone wants to convince you that this would be some new wild turf for a democracy, that person might also be a Merrick Garland apologist, trying to soften the ground or walk away from major evidence to claim that leaving this be and not creating a new precedent is the independent thing to do, while that person might be publicly spinning that thing in the very D.C. tradition of James Comey. So let me tell you something. These are strange times when insurrectionist foot soldiers and randos are prosecuted while the planners, lawyers, and televised promoters of coups remain, as of this moment, largely off limits at DOJ. And at the same time, other Republican coup plotters are literally running for office to oversee our elections and your vote. These are strange times when there is talk of violence and rebellion, but the prosecutors tasked with enforcing the law are being told, sometimes in louder and more menacing voices, that if they do find the evidence were to lead to an indictment of a citizen who happened to once hold the job of president, that enforcement of the law would then be the real danger to the republic, or would risk the unrest and violence that, well, the MAGA movement already subjected the nation to on January 6th. This is a big one. Will the people in charge, will America get this one right?